Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today again for our InTERFEWS seminar. I think mostly I see familiar faces, but I'll just reiterate that the spirit of these seminars is for us to really understand each other's work and see how we can formulate research questions and how we can work together to solve these problems and create a great program for students to be engaged in. So today we have Ken Reardon, who is from chemical and biological engineering, and was the lead on the Bioenergy IGERT from NSF, which this NRT is now a follow-on program. So he is one of the PIs in the project and will be really helpful given his experience. I'll hand it over.
Thanks, Sybil. So trying to come up with use as many hyphens as possible in this. We'll see. But I think because we come from so many different disciplines, that I start out by defining some terms, and especially because as soon as the word biofuels comes into the picture, then it's a word that's kind of been out in the general public conversation, and a lot of people think they know what it means. But I have a different definition, perhaps, than you might have in mind. So I would just start from scratch and define things straight up. All of the products I'll be telling you about today derive from biomass. So we should say, what is biomass? And it's something that at least it either is a plant or a plant, something else that does photosynthesis, like algae, or it very recently was a plant, like paper, or perhaps some food waste. But what doesn't count as biomass is oil, which I know a long time ago was photosynthetic material, but as you get it from looking at climate change issues, that was so long ago that it doesn't count in terms of carbon cycling. So that's biomass. And then all the other bio-derived things that I want to mention are what you get by converting that biomass into one of these things. So the first one that people know about is energy, and biofuels is one of those aspects, but of course there's also biothermal. That means that you take a piece of wood and you burn it in your fireplace or boiler or somewhere and directly get thermal energy from it. But there's also biopower, where you then use that combustion event to drive a turbine and get electricity. And even though you don't hear about the biothermal and the biopower, globally, they're enormous sources of energy. And that goes on all the time. But at least I'll say that's not something that I've been involved in directly. So I'll be telling you mostly about things related to biofuels, but I also wanted to mention that, for reasons I'll tell you about more shortly, that we're also interested in making chemicals other than fuels from biomass. And sometimes, this started out by saying, well, there's already this chemical being sold on the market, and yes, we can make it from biomass the same way that we make a fuel from biomass. And so then you're kind of competing in the marketplace for the exact same product, just made one from petroleum, one from biomass. People in the last few years have been advocating the idea and proving it that we can make chemicals from biomass that you cannot make from petroleum, that are actually better than what you can get from petroleum. So it's called bio-advantaged or bio-preferred, or pick a new name and make your own great acronym. And then some of those chemicals and materials, it's a little arbitrary to put materials into a different category, but I'll do it. So the idea now is, instead of synthesizing polymeric materials, plastics, from petroleum-derived starting points, you do that from biomass-derived starting points. But you can also use the biomass directly in as maybe kind of a blended material. So you might take a petroleum-derived polymer and then put lignin into it and make it stronger. So you get composites that way. So there is happening right now in Washington, D.C., it's a twice annual thing called the Advanced Bioeconomy Leadership Conference. And bioeconomy is the word that is being used to describe all of these things. It's a whole idea of making the things that we are currently getting from fossil fuel sources to get them from biomass. And so there are some, you can't read these little writings, but maybe at the top you can see, so that there are companies and research labs making all kinds of really interesting, amazing things from biomass. This is one's featuring seaweed-based packaging, dissolving polyvinyl alcohol bags, bioplastic from fruit waste, cottonized hemp, making a car seat out of bio-based composites. There's just a crazy number of things that are coming in, more and more and more each week. Go back to what is more familiar, the idea of biofuels. And again, I said that I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean are biofuels, because that's what most people think biofuels are, right? We take the corn grain and ferment it and turn it into ethanol. And so that's what you think biofuels are. And you probably, the only other one, if you really, really stretched at it, you'd come up with biodiesel, right? That you're turning used vegetable oil perhaps into biodiesel, or not even used, but soybean are being used to make biodiesel. I want to kind of convince you that it's a lot broader than that. I break this down into 3 parts. One is think about the kind of biomass, the fraction of biomass that you'd like to convert. And that means the starch or the sugar part of a plant. You could use the oily part of the plant, which they do for biofuel, biodiesel, or you could use the kind of the complex, the rest of the plant, the cellulose, the hemicellulose, and even the lignin components of biomass. The second part is how you convert that to some fuel, and you can convert it biologically and chemically or thermally or a combination of all those things. And then there's the question of what fuel it is that you actually end up making. And so yes, there's ethanol, but there's other alcohols like butanol. There's biodiesel, but there's other versions of diesel. They're called green or renewable diesel. And the list is actually very much longer. So part of the question then gets to be, well, what should we be making as a biofuel? And I'll mention something about one large project that we're involved in that gets to that question. Okay, so if there's lots of fuels that we can make from lots of different kinds of biomass, let's think about, there's an interesting history of all this. For one thing, aspects of this are not especially new. You know, we've been able to make fuels and chemicals, materials from biomass for a long time. We just used to use the whole tree anyway to make houses, so that's a material. But we've been making biofuels. We've been fermenting sugary things into ethanol for a really long time. So you can't call that as a new thing, even in kind of a millennial kind of time scale. But more recently, more seriously, the idea of using biofuels to power vehicles, that's been also around for a long time. So the first engines weren't made to run on petroleum-derived products because petroleum wasn't really around anymore. It was a lot harder to get petroleum than it was to ferment something to get ethanol or other materials. And so the first engines were made to work on ethanol and turpentine and other alcohols. The first diesel engines were run off of vegetable oils. So whole car industry and internal combustion industry got going not with petroleum-derived fuels, but with biofuels. And it wasn't just those fuels. This is a review article, not an original research article, but a review article from 1926 about making acetone and butanol. And the reason this got to be a thing was during the First World War, that the Germans and their allies captured the rubber plantations in Africa, and we needed butanol to make butyl rubber tires. And so we figured out how to make it by fermentation. So that was a bio-based material design. So we've been doing this for a while. The issue is mostly not about can we do it, it's can we do it in a way that is the first barrier that people were chasing was to do it in an economical way. So economical sustainability. And now we're also concerned with doing it in an environmentally sustainable way. But still based on the fuels thing, there's a lot of interesting history here. And so how do I set this up? This is the graph. These bars are for each annual year of spending from DOE for research and development. And the different colors, they go in order here. So the lowest one on the bottom is nuclear energy. The dark is fossil, and then orange is electrical, and yellow is energy efficiency, and the blue at the top of each bar is renewable energy, and that's where biofuels would come in. Not just biofuels, could be wind and solar in there as well, but that's where they're all parked. Okay, so history lesson 1. Why are these bars so big here in the late 70s and early 80s? The oil embargo. Right? There were several energy crises in the 70s, and so in response, there actually was eventually a response from the federal government, like we need to do something more about getting, domestic production of energy, alternative sources of energy. So there was a significant increase. I don't have in this graph the data from before then, but it definitely was an upswing in the mid to 70s. And then it unfortunately crested, which means it went down. Like up is good, plateauing would have been okay, but the down. So why did it go down?
Reagan administration.
And yeah, okay, that for sure. And then what did the administration do? They made friends with the OPEC countries and switched. Right? Exactly. So notice, and so the whole bars go down, but notice the blue bars, which is what I personally care about. The blue part of the bar really goes down in that part. Because if you've got all the oil you want, there were still really strong advocates for nuclear energy. There were strong advocates for developing fossil capabilities in the U.S. further. But the biofuels industry and solar and wind, kneecapped basically, totally really shrunk down. And so there was very little in the way of biofuels R&D that went on into this whole long period. What happened here? Why did that bar go way, way up? 2 things.
Oil and gas?
Fracking, right? Fracking was kind of growing. Fracking was kind of growing that whole time. Yeah. The stimulus, right? There was a stimulus package, ARRA. What else happened during that time? Right around the same time. It was kind of a double whammy. What? Price of oil. Fukushima also. You notice that the nuclear bargain changed. The price of oil went up from $40 a barrel to $140 a barrel right around that time. But mostly the bar is big because of the state. Okay. And where you see the price of oil coming into play is the size of the blue bar right there between 2007 and 2008. It doubled. And that was because the price, after ignoring biofuels for a really long time, price of oil went up, and everybody screamed at their representatives that we have to do something. And what happened at the tail end of the Bush 2 administration is that they put a lot of money into biofuels research and development. So one thing I've realized over the course of my career, because there's 2 things that I work on a lot, the environment and energy, they are the 2 most politically volatile research areas. It's personally rewarding in a lot of other ways, but it adds some extra interesting challenges. Yeah. Anyway, so you notice all the time also what hasn't really changed very much in here is the size of the fossil energy bar. We're still investing plenty into fossil. And so time somebody grumbles at you about subsidies for biofuels, send them my way and I will lecture at them for quite a while. So another thing that happened, and the reason I put this little arrow here, that's important. It's also part of the reason that blue part of the bar doubled around that time, had to do with a really important policy that actually was put into place initially in the first part of Bush 2 administration, and then again in the second one, and that's the Energy Independence and Security Act, and then the Renewable Fuels Standard is part of that. And so what this did is it specified that there had to be a certain amount of biofuels not produced but used in the U.S. fuel supply, transportation fuel supply. So this is what had been happening. The yellow part of these bars, that's all about the actual ethanol production. And the units here, they're billions of gallons. So when you get into these energy things, that just like you see in the numbers when you're doing carbon cycling numbers, that they're huge. We don't normally think, like we think happily about like a gallon of milk seems kind of large-ish. Billions of gallons per year that we're producing and using, and ethanol is 10% of our current fuel supply. So just multiply all those numbers by another 10, and that's the volume of fuels that we're using, liquid transport. So what the Renewable Fuels Standard did, RFS2 did, was to say that this ethanol level that we had been doing when it came into place, that would be the end, that would be kind of the cap on grain-derived ethanol. And then there was an expectation and a sort of requirement that we would be blending in all of biofuels from different sources. So not making it any more than that from corn grain. We kind of grandfathered that level in, but making more than that could happen from the rest of the plant, from the cellulosic parts, or from other sources. And then there's a part of this also that's for diesel. And so there was this projection of this mandated use. We're nowhere near close to that because of the cost of producing and the cost of the difficulties of scaling up production. But the very fact that this exists and it's out there as it's either a carrot or a stick, I guess, depending on your perspective. But companies have to prove that they can't actually get the fuel, the biofuel, to blend into their what they're selling. There's credits that they have to buy. So it's actually involved in the whole thing. So that's really motivated a lot of funding and a lot of corporate activity in this regard. And so that's an important part of like the whole picture of what we've been trying to do with biofuels. So I also pause for a moment and say, why are we doing this in the first place? There's a law in there that says now that we should be doing it, but really why? And in the time that I've been doing this, like over the last 12 years or so, the answer has shifted. The importance of each of these three has shifted for a while, especially when the price of oil spiked up like that. The first two were super important. There was the issue of supply. We were talking a lot about peak oil. What would you do after peak oil, and wondering how we were going to get liquid transportation fuels then. There was this idea of what was called energy security, and then the economics part of it. We were, for a time, importing more and more and more of our petroleum. It was above 60% for a while. And then if you look around, globally about where are we importing that from? You'd think, well, are we really going to give this giant chunk of our economic, these countries, this big influence on our economy and therefore affecting that much of the geopolitics? And most people didn't like that idea. So that was the energy security aspect. But simply I'm not an economist, but having that many billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars a year go outside the U.S. when we could be making our fuel supply, more of our fuel supply domestically, that was also part of this discussion. But then we figured out how to do fracking, that all those fossil fuel investments, paid off once, about being able to get fossil fuels domestically now. So we get not only natural gas, of course, but gasoline range molecules that we can use. So now the issues of peak oil, that's been put off. Nobody knows till quite when. There's the issues of domestic energy production. That's not really such a compelling argument, especially in DC. And we import now somewhat less than 50% of our petroleum supply. And it's trending down. So we're still, regardless, one thing that has been a constant through all of that is the issue of environmental sustainability here. And of course, that ties into what we're doing here in the InTERFEWS program. So why do biofuels, why are they maybe a more sustainable way of getting transportation fuels? So here's the simplistic picture and my really awful graphic arts capabilities, right? So you take CO2, that the plants are growing or the algae are growing with the CO2. We're converting that into a biofuel. We put that into a nice green car, and off you go. And yes, you'll release CO2 from driving around, but that's the CO2 that originally came from the air, and then it's back in the air, and more plants grow, right? Awesome. So you get this idea, and this is how when it first started getting spun up again, when we were it's either like the second or the third time through this whole excitement about biofuels, but more from the sort of the mid 2000s, this is what everybody was excited about. It's like, wow, net zero carbon production from making biofuels or from using biofuels. Yeah. So that would be nice, except of course, growing plants. Agriculture uses enormous quantities of fuel, of energy in general, but in fuel in particular, liquid transportation fuels. The process of converting that biomass into the biofuel, that takes energy inputs, and then a lesser amount of it is involved in getting the fuel from where it's made to where you would put it into. So what we're trying to do is make those energy inputs smaller and smaller, but they're not zero. So it's not true. It's not accurate to say that the biofuels can be net zero, or you can say that, but you have to do some special things in order to be able to make that true. And I'll mention one of those in a while. But anytime you say so when this, people there was this initial, wow, biofuels are a miracle, and then of course immediately or pretty soon after there was the backlash about biofuels are awful. Like they're evil. There was a headline that I used to include in my presentations that some high-ranking official at the UN said that biofuels were a crime against humanity. Moderately strong. But the important thing with all this that I think that got lost in that shuffle isn't that you can't do good, bad. It's like saying short, tall. I stand next to Rich and I think I'm short, right? So I stand next to somebody else and I think I'm tall. They're relative terms. So the question isn't about biofuels being good or bad. It's how are biofuels compared to what our other choices are, and especially what we're already doing. So how are biofuels compared to gasoline, for example? Ethanol compared to gasoline. So there's a busy diagram that you can't really see really well from the back of the room, but the idea here is this is the net energy. So the energy you get out minus what you put in, and it's on a volumetric basis, megajoules per liter. This is greenhouse gas production, also scaled by the energy content of the ethanol. And in each of those dots is some analysis from actual ethanol production that people tried to make an estimate using life cycle assessments. And there's a lot of them because it's hard to do these accurately. You're trying to involve all things into these calculations. Where we want to be, right, is down here. Where we don't want to be is up in the upper left, right, where you're not getting very much net energy, but you're spewing out a lot of greenhouse gases along the way. And there's a vertical line here at zero. We definitely want to be to the right of zero. Although, that for transportation fuels, we think that's tremendously obvious. We don't think about that in the food we eat, right? We eat it because we're hungry. We didn't really have to do a calculation about, is this giving me more usable energy today? Nor do we think about its the GHG footprint. Nonetheless, for fuels, it's a reasonable expectation. So there were a lot of discussions, and the first studies, unfortunately, to come out were the ones on the negative side, but then they were shown to use some bad assumptions, but the early bird gets the press, I guess. So they got a lot of popular press about that, saying that ethanol is terrible. This is it's actually down here now, where ethanol production is from corn grain.
Again, these are all bioenergy systems.
So all ethanol, all the two of these points are ethanol from corn grain. Right. So here's a projection of ethanol from the rest of the plant. That's in a good place of the diagram. That's what we're trying to do. That's gasoline. That's wildly controversial, but they did it carefully. But if you take in enough things into account, you could kind of believe that we think about a volume of gasoline. We think this is like a tremendous amount of energy in that liter of gasoline, and it's true. But what it took to get that also takes a lot of energy. And so that the point of this was, again, to get at this idea of the relative benefits or disadvantages of ethanol compared to what we're already doing a lot of, and also to say, here's where we're trying to go, and that there's a reason to be heading toward it and to be investing in that effort. So There's been a lot of work on this, and including from people here. So here's an article that John Field and Keith Falstein contributed to, or led, where the idea is that they're identifying, again, that producing cellulosic ethanol, not the corn grain ethanol, but the cellulosic ethanol, can actually contribute to, if you do it right, can contribute to greenhouse gas reduction. There's also this idea of what's called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The basic concept here is that you grow up a bioenergy crop, you take some of it, and you make biofuels from it, and the rest of it, you sequester that carbon, say, as biochar, and then it's locked away. And if you do that right, then you have the ability to both make, so the fuel now, you can actually assert plausibly, I guess there's some discussion about that, but I think it's plausible that you could say that biofuel, the amount of biofuel you actually produce, is actually carbon negative simply because you've taken some of that original feedstock and sequestered it away for some long time frame. So with this diagram, this is something that many of you have seen, various forecasts about the direction of temperature change, or this one is actually in the CO2 production, CO2 emissions per year. The colors are what matter. So this is a time scale on the bottom. So just notice that red is bad, green and blue are good. So the idea on the bottom of this graph, you can barely see the colors. The red, again, it's at the top. And the green and blue down here are, again, it's net CO2 emissions per year. And the x-axis, rather, is how much of our total primary energy we derive using that BECCS strategy of partial fuel making and partial sequestration. And so if you even do, say, 10% of the total primary energy using that strategy, you can get into this reduction regime, into those green and blue dots where you're actually now on the good side of CO2 or GHG emissions per year. And so the argument is that this is, you can say, what about solar and wind? But this is the only technology approach that has the possibility of generating energy while actually reducing atmospheric CO2 levels. That's what's being proposed. The scale of this, how to do this at large scale, is another issue. And what it would mean for food production and water consumption, et cetera, is also something that's up for discussion. So back to my history thing. Told you about the Renewable Fuels Standard. There's this big push for it. But what people have been realizing is that the fuel market is a really tough place, that the margins on fuels are really small. The companies make their money by selling enormous volumes of fuel, but the margin on any one little bit of it is tiny. And the existing fuel production scheme, the petroleum industry, has a tremendous advantage. They've been out for 80 plus years, and they got the benefit of scale. There's been investments over all that time, and now you're a new industry trying to do things in a new way, trying to figure out how to do this at reasonably large scales, and it's really hard and it's really expensive. And so what the companies have realized, all the ones you can find, look down the roster of the ones who, in the sort of around 2010, were saying we're going forward with making biofuels. Very few of them are still doing that and leading with that, but nearly all of them have shifted to making those biochemicals, the biomaterials that I mentioned about earlier, because the margins on those are a lot better, and you can be effective because the market size is a lot smaller. But they've all got it in mind to learn from that experience of making small volumes and getting better at scaling up and come back to fuels. That's what's going on historically. Just to kind of zoom in a little bit more on things that have been happening around here at CSU. Sybil mentioned about the NSF agate program we had in bioenergy, and one of the things that was really important that came from this, as well as some of the other efforts around that time, is that we brought together all the disciplines that are relevant in this area of bioenergy. So there were the kind of about making biomass is one, that's kind of how I thought about it. So there were plant biotechnology people, agronomists, crop scientists, all about like where should this biomass be coming from, and then there were people in the next box over about how do we convert that biomass into the biofuel or the bioenergy. So lots of science and engineering in there. Then there was a part about, well, you've made a fuel or a chemical or whatever, does it have the right properties? And especially on the fuel side, so we've got a tremendous group here at CSU who are engines experts, fuel experts. We've also got a strong polymer contingent at the university. So we have the ability to kind of go talk with them and understand if we're making the right molecules and if any impurities are coming through that are a problem. And then we also had to have kind of the overall assessment of all of that. So there had to be an economic component to it, policy experts looking at this, and then also the environmental assessment part, ecologists, people like Keith Palston and others. So hey, bringing all of that together, that whole thing started, CSU is a place, we just had a seminar visitor yesterday who commented on this, like that how good we are, how collegial we are, and good at talking across disciplinary boundaries. And so that was a huge advantage in us running this program. There's been not only this InTERFEWS program started up from this, but a few years ago, Keith Palston led a group with funding from the USDA called the Bioenergy Alliance Network of the Rockies. Still not 100% sure what an alliance network is, but this was guided at the use of the pine beetle killed pine in the Rockies, and then is broadened out a little bit to looking at other waste biomass. We had funding for this Sustainable Bioenergy Development Center. Again, that was a research-focused thing. And then there was a statewide effort that had some industry participation and brought together CSU, Mines, CU Boulder, and then NREL. Somewhere along the line, the whole thing around the Food, Energy, Water Nexus began. There was a conversation led by NSF, really, in the east of the U.S. We got some funding, and we ran a workshop that was focused kind of on the energy piece of the Food, Energy, Water Nexus. And because I was running it, I could say that biofuels had to be an important discussion topic. But we also had a lot of people here who were interested in this idea of the FEW aspects of unconventional oil and gas production. So that was an interesting angle, and that leads me to this thing about, so why did I want to feature biofuels as part of that? So here's our FEW Nexus, kind of everything's connected to everything else. But what I really wanted to do is put the climate piece there in the middle, because that's at least a driver, if not, I think it plays more than one role in this. But it's really having an influence, of course, on all of those things, and I think that to this group doesn't need to be elaborated upon. So in that context, what's the deal with biofuels? So we think about biofuels, especially if you think about it in the corn, grain, and soybean part, thinking, wait a minute, these are food products. They're on prime agricultural land, and now you're saying that you want to take some of that and make fuel. That is definitely a conflict. There's what people don't kind of understand below that. The first thing that the public usually could grab, as in this cartoon, right, that we were taking food from people's tables because we were taking the corn crop. And there were some graphs about how the price of food went up at the same time we started doing this. So the biofuels people that was this crimes against humanity thing. So the reality of that part, though, is that the reason the price of food went up so much is because the agricultural sector uses enormous quantities of oil, and oil suddenly got more expensive. And so if you look over time and you plot, this is plotting in red the world grain prices, and in the blue dotted lines the world oil prices, they are remarkably correlated. So it wasn't that we were taking some corn away. We actually increased the production of corn grain during that. And there were studies that evaluated what impact biofuel ethanol production from corn grain had on corn prices. And I think it contributed to 3% of the price increase, was the estimate. It's really the price of oil. And there is some articles that would say this, right, calling it oily food. And so that was one thing that was this big discussion point. People still remember that sometimes when I start talking about biofuels, and you have to kind of go back and assert these things. What's a less known piece, a less thought about piece about making biofuels, and again, this is now whether it's algae or biofuels crops, is that that it's nutrients that are more limiting than anything else. We can actually grow, people are investigating biofuels crops that we can make not on prime agricultural land, and algae are an obvious example of that. You can grow algae in a parking lot somewhere, we can grow algae in very, very dry areas in Nevada and West Texas and so forth. So that's not competing with prime agricultural land. The issue, though, is the nutrients part. All of these crops need nitrogen and phosphorus, and we're talking about dramatically increasing the amount of cropped land, whatever kind of crop it actually is. Where are those nutrients coming from? It's peak phosphorus that's the issue, not peak oil right now. So that's something that is an active area of research, and that people are really beginning to be more and more concerned about. There's, of course, the water consumption and indirect land use change issues. Let me just show you a little bit about that. This is a study that Bill Parton was part of here at CSU, and saying that if we were planting cellulosic feedstocks for biofuels, that you could actually make good contributions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Skip that one for now. This is about the indirect land use issue. So the idea here is that if we're promoting the use of biofuels, then that's going to compel somebody in Brazil or Malaysia or whatever to cut down the existing flora and plant biofuels crops that are, and the way they would do this result in massive greenhouse gas emissions from that land use change, and that our use of biofuels, no matter how well intentioned, is responsible for that. And so that's what this article is about. Dave Tillman is a long-term critic of biofuels done badly. So he used to be just a critic of biofuels, period, and then he kind of was a critic of biofuels done badly, which is far more reasonable. And that's really the gist of this article, is that if you do it badly, you really can screw things up, especially through those indirect land use changes. But that's a policy issue as much as anything else. The water side of it is, again, you can do it well or you can do it badly. And it's important that we're talking not only about the water quantity, how much water we're using for these new crops, but also about the quality and especially the runoff from that. So we have to do it. We have to do that well. So finally, what is it what are some of the things my group's done in this? We've been active in this for the last 10 years. Got to be more funding again. And right now, some of the projects that we've got going on in the lignocellulosic biomass side, we're part of a group. So the Department of Energy started something called the Co-Optima program. And this is looking at basically the recognition that the biofuel we're really good at making, ethanol, isn't an okay fuel, but it's not great. The ones that are great fuels, the kind of hydrocarbons that we're burning as part of gasoline now, we can make that from biomass, but really expensive and not very, it's mostly super expensive. So the idea is like, can we think about making a new era of engines and new kinds of biofuels that work well for those, and like think about developing both at the same time, and that's the co-optima idea. So we're part of a team, mostly in collaboration with NREL. There's 3 projects going on that I'm involved in now with this. It's a huge program at DOE. And so some of this is about the new class of engines are these ones that are called, they have different names, but the general concept is that they're called multi-mode engines. They sometimes act like spark ignition engines, our cars, gasoline burners, and sometimes like diesel engines that are compression ignition. And that the combination of the two can result in much better fuel efficiencies. But then the question is, we're really good at making gasoline for today's engines. What should the new gasoline or the new fuel look like? It can't look like gasoline. It can't just look like diesel. So what should it look like? And how can we stuff as much biofuel content into that as we can? So some of it we're doing with kind of more known biofuel types that we could make. But this POME thing is this new class of molecules that people have become interested in because they have interesting fuel properties. And now we have to see how can we make those from biomass. We know we can, but now we have to see what it looks like to make it, what's the life cycle assessment, what's the cost of it, and so forth. In the algae sector, 10 years ago, I didn't know anything about algae except what everybody else knows, is that you didn't want it in your swimming pool, right? And then now I'm really involved in various kinds of algal biofuels projects. The one that's got the acronym RACER, NREL's leading that one, and the idea is that for any land area of algal cultivation, how can you get the most volume of fuel out of that possible? And you do that some by having the algae grow faster into higher densities. You do it some by converting it more efficiently, and you do it some by getting every last usable molecule out of that algal biomass that you can. The second one is a new project. Right now, that if you want to grow algae faster, then you can sparge CO2 into them instead of just letting them take it in from the air. You can also sparge air. But when you're just blowing bubbles, you know what it is. Nobody will admit to doing that now as an adult, but when you're a kid, you definitely blew through the straw into your glass of soda or whatever, and you made bubbles. And that's basically what they do in these algae ponds. And since they're only about this deep, because you have to get sunlight to the ones at the bottom, then most of the CO2 that you bubble in goes right back to the air, which is really not anybody's idea of helpful. The algae farmers also spent money to get that CO2, and they don't like having more or less 90% of their investment go back up into the sky. So we have a project to figure out how to do that more efficiently. Part of that's the delivery system, part of that's engineering algae to better take up the CO2 that gets into the water faster. And then directly in response to the FEW concept, I've kind of created, at least conceptually, tried it once at NSF and it didn't fly. I was going to try it again. This idea that, so algae, when you grow up a pond, even if it looks as dark green as you can, it's at most 2% algae by mass. The rest of it is all water. So that means to get the algae out of there, you spend a lot of money moving water and separating the biomass from the water. So how about this? We're going to grow the algae in a very thin film on some kind of surface. Just have a little bit of water over the top. It's not like they're drinking it. They just need to be wet. It'll be, a large flat area. Sun is shining on it like this. They're going to be engineered to make a gaseous product, so it just goes into the gas phase above this film. And then we'll take that gas phase product, we can separate it easily from the CO2, and then we send it off to some chemical catalysis units to make it into the fuel. So the idea is that we use very little water. Once I have my film, I don't need to grow them anymore, so I use far fewer nutrients, and I still get the biofuels products I want. That's the vision. If you want to convince my NSF program manager to fund that, that's awesome. It's called an industrial leaf. That's the idea. So we'll see if that flies. But that's the one that I've written up for the grad students, the new grad students in here to do. And then with civil and some others, we're looking at a different kind of feedstock, waste, organic containing waste, that we want to convert to higher value products than the methane that's currently made as a part of biogas. And so we're going to be using new approaches to manipulating the cultures to do what we want. This is a collaboration with the folks at NREL. So I'll end up here just by saying that I think with all this stuff about the making biofuels and chemicals and materials from biomass is something I think that has a very important future for what we're trying to do, get away from the obvious disadvantages of petroleum, but we have to do it better. We have to increase the efficiency so that we can get the costs of all this down. We have to make it so that the emissions from all the parts of this that are involved, from the agricultural part and from the processing parts, are lower. Policy folks, that's a big issue in the US. We have such inconsistent and varying policies around this that it's hard for business to get on board and to do this, to really invest in it, because they they're looking at planning 20, 30 years out, and they can't even tell what's happening in 2 years. It's a problem. But I also hope that I've made it clear about how all of this, with all these advantages, is really tied into this FEW concept that we're looking at making energy, but it's, there's the competition potentially, or definitely the overlap with the agricultural sector. Water is important for all parts of this thing. So I think it's a really good fit for this program. I know I've talked for a long time now, but I'd be happy to answer. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So this was a great overview of challenges and some of the benefits and different aspects of biofuels. It seems like my impression, kind of supported by some of the things that you said, but obviously my knowledge about this issue is very shallow. It seems like biofuels, there is a very well-established literature and sets of research that show the disbenefits and challenges with biofuels. Mm-hmm. So if you think, I'm very familiar with the water quality aspects. I just don't understand how we can mitigate the water quality consequences of large-scale biofuel productions in the absence of substantially changing the way agroecosystems work, and we can mitigate water quality impacts. And then you talked about the fact that in fuel production, the margin is so narrow that economic emphasis has to be very strong.
Right.
So if you think about a trading ratio between benefits and adverse consequences, that ratio has to be really substantial to make a move in terms of policy and economics of it.
Sure.
I don't know if anybody has looked at it, whether ever we're going to have a supply and demand market that will meet, given all of these wedges that constantly pull supply and demand away from each other.
So there's just to unravel a couple of things that you mentioned. There's about 20 points in there to address.
One question.
So for one thing, you said you knew about water quality aspects for biofuels.
Like particularly nutrient loadings from.
So which crop?
Mostly corn.
So does anybody have that question when it comes to the agricultural sector? Do you run around saying we should no longer make corn because it has this terrible water quality problem? Some people do, but I didn't hear you say that. You didn't talk about unseparating agriculture, food production from these water quality issues. So the thing is, corn is a really horrible crop. Flat out, right? It's terrible. We shouldn't be making it for anything. Do you know what happens to the corn crop? What do we do with the corn grain that we make?
Sure.
Half of it we turn into ethanol. And the other half, we make high fructose corn syrup. Really vital, critical thing for us to be making, right? To screw up the environment that much to make sugar stuff. And we also turn a lot of that into animal food. And so do you want to talk about that? The footprint of animal and whether we so again, it's this things relative to numbers. So that's all that thing. So what people are looking at is other crops that can first grow on more marginal land, so we're not competing even for this prime land. So you might have heard of miscanthus. People hear about sweetgrass. They use less water. Miscanthus is really cool because it's a perennial, and it needs far less nutrient inputs in the first place. The productivity, the biomass productivity per hectare is enormous compared to what you get from corn. And if we're looking into the cellulosic component of that, we use all of it and not just a little piece of it. So, and because we're not adding the nutrients in the same way, we don't have those water quality issues from the run. The other part is on the economic side of this thing, is that it is what I said is absolutely true. One of the things that everyone is anticipating in this, who's trying to have a business in this area, is that there will be a price on carbon at some point. And that changes everything. You can tell me where I was wrong about my crops.
At some point on why.
Okay.
So, I'm totally with you there.
This is really more fun when I go to give lectures in the animal science department.
Yeah. Yeah. I have plenty of data to support what you said.
Good.
That perennials reduce. So, but
Yeah,
And it
it's true.
seems kind of, is it stagnant? I mean, is it moving
It certainly,
forward? What's
that's
the?
my perception too, is that they haven't made the advance movement on this, even up to 5 years ago, I guess. And it seems to me like in the last 5 years, it's all been very quiet relative to what's going on, relative to, and admittedly, the articles, the things that I read more about are what we do with the biomass, not making it. But still, I'm at enough events and look at enough kind of higher level analyses. I would have thought I would have caught something if people had been accelerating either the land area that was planted in these or whatever about it. But
It seems assumed that we're going to get there.
yeah, I'm properly motivated. I think that's maybe part of it, is that why should it? What are the forces right now that would be pushing farmers, for example, to go in that direction? I think they're pretty small, and that's what needs to be changed.
Conversion process.
Conversion. So the conversion process, yeah, I guess that could play a role too. There's a lot of work being done on that, and a lot of things being done at larger and larger scales. But they can do what they're doing now with corn stover. Plenty of that around. So.
But I mean, the process seems non-economic.
It's been difficult, and it's not always clear that it's just an economic thing. How much of that is economics? How much of that is technology? And how much of that is poorly run businesses? And some really unfortunate stories in that realm. But it's also I'm convinced on the technology side of these there's been movement in the right direction about how to.
And let's remember that Ken started biofuels think really narrowly about what they are, but we don't have to grow plants. We also have all these waste materials. Those aren't as efficient to generate the biofuels because if we take our animal manure or our waste, we've already taken out a lot of the easily accessible components. But those waste materials are always going to be around, and those are biofuels, potential biofuels that we're not accessing. I think the nutrient thing I think is really interesting because that you brought up this point about the nitrogen and phosphate, that the costs of agriculture go up so much with the prices of fuel. Yet when we talk about trying to recover nutrients from our waste materials and from plant biomass and all these things, people don't do it because it's not economic, and the cost of those are human-made fertilizers or manufactured fertilizers is still so low, even though they're a huge sink of fossil fuels. And any life cycle assessment that's done, they're just massive in terms of their impact in terms of fossil fuels. I don't know how we reconcile that, perceive the low cost with the huge amount of fossil fuels that it takes to make those.
Yeah, so on the technology side, there's actually an increasing investment in alternative ways to make ammonia. Right now, Haber-Bosch is the disaster that you mentioned.
Yeah.
There's a giant Haber-Bosch ammonia plant outside of Cheyenne. But yeah, so they're a problem. One of the just as an interesting other thing that's really an FEW topic of its own, is that the price of electricity now, renewable electrons now become so cheap through solar and wind that it's actually viable to think about that as essentially a reagent, an input to making other chemicals. And so people are working on using these renewable electrons with atmospheric nitrogen, basically reducing the nitrogen in the air to ammonia, as totally sidestepping all of that. I think it's a ways out still, but it's amazing how advances in one arena, about solar and wind, can then have this other completely unanticipated, open up some other unanticipated possibilities. But recovering the nutrients that we're already moving through our system is kind of an obvious place to start, I think.
My question about you've got feedstocks that have lots of nitrogen, products that don't have.
Right.
And what kinds of systems
Yeah, so really at this point, the only one that I know about is to use hydrothermal liquefaction. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically you take wet solids, which are ideally coming out of things coming out of a fermentation unit, for example, and then you subject them to when a chemical engineer says moderate temperatures and pressures, that's probably not maybe what biologists would think about moderate, but a few hundred degrees C and a few atmospheres of pressure, and then basically you make you just turn it all into a soup. You break down the big molecules into small ones, and it results in an oily fraction and an aqueous fraction, and the inorganics like the nitrogen and phosphorus are in that aqueous fraction, and people have developed ways to try to recover them out. Gasification does the same thing. So that's the main way that I know of, but it's an extra step and an extra cost, and that's where the crux is. So with a lot of these things, especially through the IGRT, through starting from the various courses there and learning from all of my colleagues from other disciplines, I got to know about this really useful concept of externalities. Maybe a lot of you know about that, but it's a hugely important concept in this whole area of energy, and I think it has a lot. Maybe something we should definitely have put into those first two courses, because it explains why there are these imbalances and what makes sense and what should be. But we're not pricing out the cost of the waste treatment or anything else. We're not pricing out health effects. We're not pricing it. Any of those costs aren't in the cost of the fuel that we buy or the food that we eat. And I think to the extent that those can come in, with biofuels, for example, one of the reasons kind of behind the scenes why they have trouble competing is because they address some of those externalities, but they get no credit for it at all. So I think that's way too complicated of a policy to have Congress get behind right now, but maybe eventually it'll become so obvious that they'll have to pack it in.
Well, in California, it's by 2040, they're talking about 100% renewable energy.
Right.
100%.
Yep.
You're not considering bioenergy. It seems like what you characterize that is very, and I hadn't personally thought about that. The margins on making money out of fuel is so narrow. And the competition for land, water, and other aspect is so tremendous that perhaps, at least with the technologies that we have now for bioenergy production, competition with solar, hydropower, and wind is challenging. It seems like that's what is emerging as.
Well, yeah. So that question often comes up. Hey, electric cars coming. Why do you need these biofuels in the first place? So I think one of the things I hear you say.
Well, they're talking about 100% renewables for the entire economy and the entire energy production, including vehicles.
Yeah. The penetration of electric vehicles into the U.S. cars on the road right now, the vehicles on the road, is at 1 or 2%, something like that. The projections for how much that's going to change, like what will that look like in 20 years? 20%, something. You got to have all these vehicles running around that are not electric. You have to do something about those. You fly once in a while, right? You want to be on an electric plane?
No. Right now, I do not want to be on a plane at all.
Well, that's
electric or otherwise.
Yeah, I always think that the last thing I want to see when I get on a plane is look out on, and especially an overnight flight, is to look on the wings and see solar cells pass. The battery's way too much. You couldn't do that. No, so the idea is that the argument those of us in the biofuels world make is that there will be a need for biofuels, liquid transportation fuels, for several decades more. And the other thing is, the reason why this whole bioeconomy argument is, I think, a powerful piece of it is that we're not just talking about doing something else for fuels. We're talking about doing something else for all of the chemicals that we use, polymers that we're part of our lives and everything else. So all of that gets made in a similar way. It's just made the volumes are different. But they face the same issues, though, in terms of this nexus.
Thank you so much.
Okay.